وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين الحجة ابن الحسن المهدي فداه أرواح العالمين. قال مولانا أمير المؤمنين وقائد الغر المحجلين أسد الله الغالب علي بن أبي طالب صلوات الله وسلامه عليه في كتاب له إلى محمد بن أبي بكر: واعلموا عباد الله أن المتقين ذهبوا بعاجل الدنيا وآجل الآخرة. صدق مولانا أمير المؤمنين سلام الله عليه. Some say that we are trying to suppress the desires of human beings, that we are trying to repress people and stop them from satisfying their natural human desires and temptations. They say that we are trying to render people's lives hopeless and meaningless and boring by telling them that this is right, this is wrong, this is allowed, that is forbidden. Our response to that is far from it. It is a widely misunderstood issue that a lot of people have against those who adhere to any religion whatsoever, and namely Islam, because Muslims tend to display more signs of their religious tendencies than the followers of other religions. Jews and Christians have the same tendencies, but with Muslims, the case is intensified. Muslims, both men and women, members of both genders, tend to display these signs of their religious tendencies more than other people, followers of other religious denominations and so forth. And so a lot of people have this misconception that Muslims deprive themselves of the fruits of life. Muslims do not enjoy themselves in this life, and they opt for a better life in the hereafter. So they don't care what happens in this life. It doesn't matter to them. What matters is what happens on the other end of the line and at the end of the tunnel. But that's not the case. I mean, if you look at, for example, the history of our leaders, the history of the commander of the faithful, and Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, was a man who was known for his humbleness. He was known for his piety. He was known for the fact that he never gave any attention to the physical material life. In fact, even devious sects such as the Sufis, for example, both Sunni and Shia Sufis, they take Imam Ali as their idol and their leader because they develop this sort of tendency to keep away from the fruits of life and not eat good food and not wear good clothes. And this is why they were called Sufis initially. It's because they used to dress up with harsh clothes made of wool. And so they claim that their master and their idol is the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali, because that is all they have known from him, a man who doesn't pay any attention to the material life. But let's take a look at the numbers and compare the lives of Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, with his enemies, those who did give a lot of importance and significance to the material life, and see which one of these two categories was the happier and led the more fulfilling and joyful life. But before I do that, the quote I mentioned by the commander of the faithful roughly translates as this. He says in a letter addressed to Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, who was one of his closest aides and companions, a man who was so loyal to the commander of the faithful to the extent that Imam Ali used to say that he is my son, but he is a descendant of Abu Bakr, even though Abu Bakr was one of them. I mean, he was one of the competitors of Imam Ali, that's for sure. He was a man who offered himself the chance to take the position of the leader of the Muslim Ummah at a time when Imam Ali saw himself as the only legitimate successor to the Prophet, to say the least. And the son of this very same man rejects his father's doctrine and ideology and philosophy, joins the ranks of the soldiers and the companions and the aides of the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali alayhi salam, and he became so loyal and so sort of overwhelmed with the joy and the privilege of being an aide to Imam Ali, that Imam Ali said that about him. Now, at the last years of his life, Imam Ali appointed Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr as the ruler of Egypt. And just a quick note, when we read the books of traditions, and namely Nahj al-Balagha, or as translated wrongfully, I might add, as the Peak of Eloquence, this book is one of those books that, in order for you to understand the Holy Quran, you need to read this book. You need to understand that book fully for you to be able to understand the Holy Quran in a better way. And all books of traditions, that as we've talked about in the previous nights, that is their main role. For you to understand Islam fully, for you to understand the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you need to start with the traditions of Alulbayt, who are the teachers of this holy book. The Nahj al-Balagha is an example of that. It's one of those books that we need to understand. And it truly is the peak of eloquence. It's a book that no one has ever been able to compete with. No other book has been written that has the same level of eloquence and beauty and deep knowledge within the words and within the sermons and within the maxims and the letters that were compiled in this book by the Sharif al-Radi. Now, to understand Nahj al-Balagha, in turn, as we said, it's like a first step to understanding the Holy Quran, but to understand Nahj al-Balagha, you would actually need to study the history of Imam Ali and the chain of events that occurred at the time of the commander of the faithful to know what he intended in those sermons and letters and maxims. If you go back at the time of Imam Ali, you will see a very wide-ranging and deep struggle that was going on at the time. There were so many wars erupting here and there. The commander of the faithful himself had to go through many different wars, and that was only after becoming the Khalifa, the successor to the Prophet. After that, a lot of people weren't happy with the way he would implement justice under his reign and under his rule, because that was one thing that he always stood for. And he never abandoned the concept of justice. He implemented it in the best possible way. And he truly manifested the word of justice through his rules and his reign. To the extent that, as we said, he was so humble that someone would come up to him and he'd open something like a jar that was sealed off with some mud. And the man also noticed that the mud had the seal of Imam Ali himself, his own seal, onto the mud. And when asked about that, the commander of the faithful replied by saying, I have put this seal in order to find out if anyone tried to open it. Because sometimes my children, Imam Hussain and Imam Hussain, would come and open the seal and add a little bit of oil to the bread that I've conserved in this jar. Now the man doesn't know what Imam Ali is talking about until he actually pulls out the piece of bread, the loaf of bread that he had in the jar. He says that the bread was so rotten that the smell annoyed me. The man sitting next to Imam Ali. This was his food. And he was the ruler of 50 countries, and I'll get to that later on. So let's take a quick look at the history. Imam Ali appoints Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr as the ruler of Egypt, and he sends this letter as sort of his statement of assignment, or whatever you want to call it, to Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, sort of giving him an outline of the ways he should rule the country, the things he should do, the things he should avoid by being a leader and a ruler. Some very nice recommendations, and I would suggest that you all read that letter. It's very nice. And the reason he sends Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, makes him a ruler of Egypt, is because Imam Ali has placed a lot of importance on Egypt itself. If you look at the Nahj al-Balagha, for example, you'll find a lot of different sermons and traditions and letters addressed to the people of Egypt or to the rulers of Egypt. And this sort of makes you wonder what was so important about Egypt. Well, perhaps the commander of the faithful was trying to make us understand the significance of this country. It's a country that nowadays has a population of around 70 million. A population that is so receptive to the light of Alulbayt, peace and blessings be upon them. A country that has a lot of people in it that were willing and continue to be in a position where they would defend the faith of Ahlul Bayt. And that's why Imam Ali in the same letter says, إِنِّي وَلَّيْتُكَ أَعْظَمَ أَجْنَادِي أَهْلَ مِصْرَ. I am sending you as the ruler of the best of my soldiers, the people of Egypt. It's very it's amazing how Imam Ali emphasized the role of Egypt. And up until today, from a political point of view, it's a pretty famous saying in the Arab world that they say there is no war with Israel without Egypt, and there is no peace with Israel without Syria. So Egypt is really important. It's strategically located. It has a lot of different combinations within it that make it important, and it was even important to Imam Ali. So that's the historical account. He sends the letter. Among the recommendations, there is the one that I recited at the beginning of the lecture, that in which Imam Ali says that the pious ones have both won the readily available favors of this world as well as those of the hereafter. So this contradicts totally the widely spread misconception that religion tries to suppress the human desires and repress the human temptations and the satisfaction of those desires and temptations. Because he is saying that those who are pious, they are blessed by the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to an extent that they both enjoy this life as well as the hereafter. There is no need to endure and suffer. There is no rule that says anyone who is associated with religion has also to be associated with oppression and suffering and so forth. There is no such thing. Now let's take a look at the life of the commander of the faithful. If the faithful are supposed to suffer, let's take a look at the commander of the faithful. And let's take a look at the statistical aspect of his life and the numbers. The commander of the faithful married 17 women during his life, collectively. Not at the same time, obviously. But the number of women that he married during the course of his life was 17. Starting with the master of the women of this world as well as the hereafter, Fatima az-Zahra, peace and blessings be upon her. A woman who was by far the best woman in the world. The master of all women, including the Virgin Mary and everyone else. That was his first wife. Now, he also ended up at the end of his life, the number of children that he conceived was 29. Almost 30 children. I don't even know someone at this time who has 30 children or 29 children. And I'm pretty sure you don't either. You probably heard of, your great godfather or something that had something close to that, say 15 or 16 children. But 29? The commander of the faithful conceived 29 children. Now not only that, but he had the chance to govern and rule 50 of today's countries. Now 50 of today's countries, even though it's a really vast tract of land, but back then it was even greater than now. It was 2/3 of the world of the discovered political map of the time 1400 years ago. 2/3 of the whole world. He governed all that from the African west coast all the way through North Africa, Central Africa, the Middle East, and all the way to the Indian subcontinent. All these countries and lands were under the rule of the commander of the faithful. He governed them for 5 years. He died at the age of 63. And when he died, he didn't just die on a deathbed. He wasn't struck by lightning. He was killed. He was murdered. He was martyred. In other words, if he hadn't been martyred, he would have probably have continued to live for a long time after that, because he lived a very healthy life. In fact, in one tradition, he likens himself to a very rough plant that grows in the desert. He says that I am tough and I'm powerful because I'm like one of those plants that grow in the desert. They can't find any water, and so what they do is that they extend their roots in the soil, and they just become more and more powerful, because the longer the roots, the harder it gets to uproot the plant. Whereas someone who's living in a life of comfort, a life of convenience, a life of no problems whatsoever, those kinds of people, they are like the plants that grow within water channels. They're so weak. The slightest increase in the intensity of the water flowing might cut them off. Whereas he's powerful because he led a very healthy life. And so if he wasn't killed at the age of 63, he would have probably have continued to live until, I don't know, 90 or something. And in fact, there's a tradition that states if Alulbayt, alayhim salam, if they were not killed, they would have lived for as long as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted them to. Just like the awaited Savior, Imam al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayh, لذكره الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على وآل محمد. So, he lived up until the age of 63. And today, if you look at the number of children, the number of people that are descendants of Imam Ali, one study that was made, I think around 25 years ago, suggested that the number of descendants of Imam Ali and Fatima al-Zahra, peace and blessings be upon them, approaches around 20 million people, and this was 25 years ago. 20 million descendants of Imam Ali. He had 29 children, and now he's got 20 million, like a whole country worth of his own descendants, people that are direct descendants of him. And the black turban on my head is a symbol of that as well. And there are so many other people like me. 20 million is not a small number. Now, where are the children of Yazid and Muawiyah? Where are the descendants of Abu Sufyan and the likes of them? Because at the time when Imam Hussain, peace and blessings be upon him, was martyred, at the time when his entire family was annihilated, at the time when his 6-month-old infant was slaughtered from the jugular vein to the jugular vein, and he was left with no one but Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him. At that time, the Umayyads had thousands of infants in silver cradles being fed with golden spoons. Thousands of them. Where are they today? Where are their graves? Where are their cemeteries? Nothing. They thought that they annihilated the descendants of the Prophet. And look what's happened now. When you want to evaluate somebody's life, you take a look at the bigger picture. When you look at Imam Ali's life, true, he was very humble. It's true that he was neglectant of the physical, material world. But look at the bigger picture. At the end of his life, he looks up to the sky and he says, Assalamu alaikum ya malaikata rabbi. Peace be upon you, O angels of my Lord. And then he says, لِمِثْلِ هَذَا فَلْيَعْمَلِ الْعَامِلُونَ. At the very end of his life, everything is over. If he endured, then he endured. If he enjoyed his life, then he enjoyed his life. At the end, he is sending his peace and blessings upon the angels that had come to take him to a paradise that he says, for this, let the competitors compete. For this, let those who give an effort, give their effort. Now, this is only the physical aspect of Imam Ali's life. At the same time, look at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded him with. لا يجوز أحد الصراط إلا وبيده صك من علي ibn Abi Talib. On Judgment Day, on the day of resurrection, for you to pass the thin rope that separates the desert of the reckoning, where everyone's standing, and paradise, and underneath there being hellfire, for you to pass that, you need a passport. You need a travel document. You need official documents issued by the commander of the faithful. And those who are followers of Ahlul Bayt, they get a big bold title at the beginning of their list of actions that says, as the Prophet of Islam says, عنوان صحيفة المؤمن حب علي بن أبي طالب. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. That is the title of the list of your actions that you get on the Day of Judgment. Now there is a title on that travel document, and there is a seal at the end. The seal is given to you by Fatima al-Zahra, peace and blessings be upon her. And the title is the name of the commander of the faithful. That is only a glimpse of the power and the glamour and the importance and significance of Imam Ali in the hereafter. Now, that's the commander of the faithful. Let's take a look at his enemies. His arch enemy, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Okay, this man, the son of Abu Sufyan, the commander of the idolaters that tried to kill the Prophet. His mother was Hind Akilat al-Akbad, the woman who tried to chew the liver of Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet. This man, the so-called self-proclaimed commander of the Muslim nation, he's the arch enemy of Imam Ali. Do you know what he had for food? His food was composed of they'd get pigeons and small birds, slaughter them, take out the brains of those pigeons, now, and I think mash it all together, add honey to it, and they'd give it to Muawiyah for food. Now, how many pigeons do you need to create a food that would be satisfying and enough for Muawiyah to be fed up with? Muawiyah was the man about whom the Prophet said, La ashba' Allah lahu batna. Because one day the Prophet, he was supposedly given the title of the writer of the revelations. Because the Prophet never wrote anything, as you probably know. Even though he had the ability to read and write, it was not the Prophet. It is wrong to say that the Prophet didn't have the ability to write and read. He did have that intellectual capacity, but he never did. So one day the Prophet calls upon him, says, well, you know, we've hired you as the writer of the revelations. I have a revelation. I need you to write it for me. The Prophet sends a messenger. The messenger comes back saying, he says, I'm busy. I'm too busy eating. The Prophet is calling upon you. If you call yourself a faithful and a believer in the Prophet, you'd come hurrying down. He never comes. The Prophet sends a messenger again and says, it's important, let him come. There's a revelation. The messenger comes back saying the exact same thing. He's too busy eating. The third time the Prophet sends a messenger and comes back empty-handed, he says, the Prophet prays to God that Muawiyah would never have the ability to reach satiety and be fed up and content with the food that he eats. And that's why he used to eat and eat and eat to an extent that his stomach would fall to the side. You know, he'd eat so much and stop eating, not because he was content, but because he was tired of eating and chewing. You know, na'udhu billah. So this man, if he wants to get fed up, how many pigeons do you need to slaughter? God knows how much. They'd get their brains, mix it with honey, and this was like, you know, the biggest feast, you know, the biggest tyrants would love that for food. Now that's Muawiyah. Now who do you think enjoyed his food more, Imam Ali or Muawiyah? Imam Ali was the one who would eat rotten bread. And in fact, the bread was so hard that he had to break it on his ankle. He'd hold the bread loaf in his hand and break it on his leg, on his ankle. The commander of the faithful is the man who broke open the gates to Khaybar single-handedly. Yet when he wants to break that bread, he breaks it on his ankle. That's how hard it was. Now, was he more content and satisfied with his hard, rotten loaf of bread? Or Muawiyah, who was never fed up? So, that's one example. Look at the Pharaoh of Egypt. Here was a man, just one small example because we're running out of time. The Pharaoh of Egypt, having been living in Egypt, which is a relatively hot area, in Cairo especially, the Jeza, he would send people all the way to Damascus, and they'd work out the timing in order for them to reach Damascus and the Sham area, as it used to be known, reach there at a time when it was winter and there was a lot of snow. So they'd go all the way there. It would take them, the soldiers and you know, the slaves and the Israelites that he used to send to carry out that mission, it would take them 3 months to get there. And what they would do is that they'd take a huge chunk of ice, an iceberg, and drag it all the way back to Cairo. Again, taking 3 months. By the time it got to Cairo, the big iceberg had turned into a small piece of ice. And he'd take that, put it in a cup of water, and drink it. The man wants to live it up. He doesn't believe in the hereafter. So he just wants that that glass of water to be cold. And so he's prepared to send troops and slaves, a lot of people dying on the way, in a mission that took 6 months so he could enjoy that glass of water. And to tell you the truth, you know, once I was told that the top executives of Boeing, you know, the aircraft manufacturer, what they would do is that they'd send an airplane every day from Seattle, which is the headquarters of Boeing, all the way to Paris to their favorite restaurant and get food and bring it back to, you know, Seattle for them to enjoy a good lunch at the office. And I told the man that told me this, I said, if they'd be crazy not to do that. Because they don't believe in the hereafter. They don't believe in heaven or hell. They don't believe in God. So might as well just live it up and have some fun. You know, I used to have a friend who was really, truly pathetic, with all due respect. He wasn't a friend. He was just a classmate. And one day, he was really acting crazy. And he was sort of committing sins and saying really bad things. So I told him, what's your goal in life? What is it that you are planning to achieve in your life? And you know what he told me? He said, I just want to, and sort of paused at the beginning. He said, I just want to live it up, have fun with girls, and then die. You know, and it's interesting how you remember death, because a lot of people don't even do that. But trying to be as truthful as possible, he said, I want to live it up, whatever the hell that means. Have fun with girls, which is probably the dominant issue that sort of, you know, was in his mind 24/7. And then die. So if you know that you'll end up dying, then what's the point? Think of a better alternative. So these people, they don't believe in anything, so they just want to live it up. They want to have the maximum amount of pleasure during their lifetimes, because they know that there won't be anything for them on the other end of the tunnel. There is nothing. So would they have enjoyed their lives more, or the commander of the faithful? Having taken into consideration the bigger picture, remember, because sometimes when they evaluate the top CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, they talk about a concept called, what is this person worth? So they go beyond the bank accounts. They don't just look at, for example, the possessions of Bill Gates in his offshore bank accounts or so forth. No, they look at a person's net value. How much is this person worth? How much, you know, real estate does he have? How many charities does he control? How much cash does he have, obviously? How many cars does he drive? So they take a look at the bigger picture. And that's why they end up telling you that Bill Gates is, I don't know, something like $40 billion worth. And, you know, Steve Jobs is $15 billion worth. Walid ibn Talal is $35 billion. Because they take a look at the bigger picture and they tell you, this is how much this person's worth. You need to take a look at that bigger picture. When you're evaluating someone like Imam Ali, don't just look at the loaf of bread that he's consuming. No. Look at the last statements made at the end of his life. This is what he said, addressing the angels. For this, let those who want to put enough effort, because it's all worth it. At the end of their lives, Muawiyah, Fir'aun, all these people, they didn't have anything. They had nothing, and that's why the pharaohs of Egypt, as well as the Chinese rulers, they would take all their, you know, they would take their wives, their gold and their jewelry and everything with them to their grave. They would actually, that was a part of their, you know, that was their thing. They would take everyone and everything they had with them to the grave, because they didn't want to feel that they're departing everything that they've worked so hard for. The Chinese were even worse. The Chinese rulers would bury an entire army, all the top generals. You know, I'm sure those generals would pray day and night that God would extend the life of this king or queen or something, because they knew that if a person dies, they'd have to be buried alongside with them, along with their horses and their military uniforms and everything. It's crazy, but for them it's not, because they're thinking, I have nothing when I die, so I might as well take everything with me. I know it's a load of garbage, but that's their own mentality. Who had more fun, them or the commander of the faithful? Of course Imam Ali did. I mean, take a look. Go beyond the tabloids, my friends. Go beyond the magazine covers. Go beyond the TV screen. Get out of the box. Go beyond all these, you know, pictures and what the paparazzi are trying to promote in our society. Try and think of the essence of these people's lives. I was reading an article that says those who win the lottery, the first thing they do is that they would spend 85% of their wealth within the first 5 years. So after 5 years, they'd be left with almost nothing. Because they become so crazy and so overwhelmed with the joy of winning the lottery that they keep spending all the money. And not only that, there is a psychological problem that a lot of these people actually have after winning the lottery. They call it the sudden wealth syndrome. In other words, if you suddenly become wealthy, you have all these sorts of you know, different psychological problems that could even lead to depression, isolation. You become almost crazy because you've won money. Don't think that these people are enjoying their lives. That's why a lot of actors and actresses and pop stars and, you know, the wealthy and the famous and the rich, they end up committing suicide. Why? Why is it that the highest rate of youth suicide is in Sweden? Sweden is a wealthy country. Why is it that we don't see people in Iraq, for example, committing suicide, or Afghanistan, or where they have so much misery and pain? Why? Because those are the people that have seen the bitter with the sweet. You can't have it, you know, all sweet. If you've seen bitterness, you know the beauty of the sweet. If you've seen nighttime, you know how nice it is to see the sun. When you're living in a city where, you know, you don't get to see the sun very often, it's got clouds and you know, the weather is really, really bad, with all due respect. It's really nice to see the sun again one day. That's why everybody goes out on the streets and they go for a jog, and everybody tries to use that time to their advantage because the sun's out there. If you've had these problems, you know how nice it is to see the opposite of all that. I once went to a nursing home, and I would encourage all of you to do the same. You know, to go to these places where that remind you how privileged we are and how satisfying our lives are. Places that remind you that you have a perfect religion, my friends. I would suggest that you would go to, you know, nursing homes, cemeteries, crematoriums, places that remind you of death, places that remind you of the low mentality of other people. And I went to this nursing home. I sat down and I started talking to a really old woman. I think she was 93 years old or something, and she almost made me cry because she said that she had a son, but she hadn't seen her son for about 2 years. Now, no one in the Muslim world, where people are religious, no one would throw their parents in a nursing home because there's a bond, and that bond is created by piety. That bond was created by the religion of Islam that tells you you are responsible towards your parents just as your parents were responsible towards you. You need to take care of them the way they took care of you. And if you take your mother on your back, take her to perform the pilgrimage to Hajj 40 times, you will not compensate your mother, as the Prophet said, for a single sleepless night that she spent giving you milk and taking care of you, or when you were sick and so forth. That bond was created by piety, and this is what brings the generations together, and it makes everyone care about the other. And this is why the Commander of the Faithful says that the pious people have won both the readily available fruits and favors of this world as well as the hereafter. We ask the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to truly bless our lives and to give us more knowledge about our masters, the Alulbayt alayhimus salam, and to give us satisfying, fulfilling lives both in this world as well as the hereafter. هذا والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد. أحسن الله عليك والله يحفظك إن شاء الله. سيدنا سيد مهدي. عندنا Q&A ولا لا؟ Q&A أكو؟ أكو question. سيد فاضل شو يقول؟ شيخ نرجو المعذرة خلاص سامحونا الله يحفظكم إن شاء الله صلى الله عليكم وأسمعكم الله يحفظكم إن شاء الله. If you have any questions for which I have the answer, inshallah, I'd be happy to discuss any questions or things that you might have. نعم تفضل. English would be better. Okay, first of all, once I was in Hajj, and we sort of, the followers of Alulbayt, they performed their pilgrimage in a slightly different way. So, it's a long story, but we got in a taxi, and the person asked me, why did you do this? You know, this is not the tradition of the Prophet. I told him, instead of saying, no, it is the tradition, and what you're following is wrong, I said, let me ask you a question. When the Prophet died, what was the day on which he died? Was it a Wednesday, a Thursday, a Saturday, a Sunday? What was it? And he didn't have an answer.